Hello students, today we are going to learn about plot. So what is a plot? A plot is the series of events that make up a story. There are many elements to a plot, and if you are missing an element, you have a very strange story, or a story that doesn't make sense, or a story that's very boring. So it's important to understand what makes a plot interesting and good for reading. Why do we need to know about plot? The parts of plot are used in all good stories. If you understand how they work, you're going to be better able to understand the stories that you read, and you're going to be better able to write and tell better and more interesting stories. A typical plot has 6 main parts. The first and the beginning of a story is called the exposition. The exposition will go into more detail, but that's kind of like where you get started and you get to know what's going on in general in the setting and with the characters in your story. The main conflict begins at the beginning of the story, and it kind of causes all the other events to happen, and it causes the interest of the story. The rising action builds tension up to a climax. And then you have falling action and your conclusion or resolution. The exposition. So here it's also known as the introduction, but it begins the story, and it's very, very important. If you don't have an exposition, your reader is lost right away. They don't really know what's going on. So you need to include the background information about your characters, the setting, which includes time and place, and other basic things. So any other history that your characters have or that's important to your story needs to be discussed in the exposition. So right now you're going to take a second, and unfortunately we're not going to think, pair, share, but you are going to answer a few questions. The questions will be, what is an exposition? And what problems would a story have if they didn't have an exposition? And then you're also going to answer a question, what is necessary for a good exposition or introduction? Now that you've had some time to think about what an exposition does and why it's important, we're going to kind of discuss it here. So an exposition sets up the problem. It's not maybe introducing the problem, but it's setting the stage, which means it's setting up events that will cause the problem to happen. It also introduces the main characters, which means you understand who and what these people are about so that you understand why they make the decisions that they do that probably leads to the problem. You also need to know the setting. Again, that is the time and the place. And it establishes the tone and mood, which again is kind of how you feel about the story. The exposition leads to the main conflict, and a conflict is a problem. So the main conflict is the main problem in a story. And in the rest of the story, the characters are going to spend about 90% of their time trying to solve that main conflict. So in a story, why is the main conflict important to have? What problem would you have in a story without that conflict? And what is necessary for a good main conflict? And so if you think about it, what makes a good conflict? What makes it interesting? And something that you want to continue reading about. So now that you've had some time to discuss by typing out your answers, what makes a good main conflict? It is interesting and worth reading about. So it's not just like a mundane everyday problem that can be solved very easily. It's something very unique and maybe a little bit more difficult to figure out than a general everyday problem. It's also big enough to last the whole story, so it doesn't get solved, like I was saying, in 5 minutes. It needs to be something that the characters have to struggle through. It's not solved too easily or quickly, and it's truly something that the main character would care about. Now we're on to rising action. So the rising action begins with the start of the main conflict. This is where the characters are addressed by the conflict, and then they have to try to solve the conflict. Interesting stories don't let characters beat their problems on the first try. So this goes back to the last side. It's not solved too easily. and it's the longest part of the story. So the rising action is about 90% of the story, and the story, they might have many opportunities to try to solve the problem, or they might struggle through solving the conflict multiple times, but they won't solve it right away. So now you're going to answer some questions. Why is the rising action important? And what problems would the story have without rising action? And finally, what is necessary for a good rising action? Now that you've had time to answer those questions, we can kind of discuss what makes a good rising action. So it's the longest part of the story by far. So it's a substantial part of the story. It doesn't get solved. The conflict doesn't get solved right away. The main characters have to try lots of different ways to fix the main conflict. The scenes and events get more exciting and suspenseful, and they're not too quick or lacking details. So they have tons of detail. They're describing feelings, words, actions, and setting as it goes along. The next part of the story is the climax, and this is usually the most exciting part of the story, and it's also known as the turning point. And I think a lot of people really struggle to identify the climax sometimes because it's not always as obvious as you'd think it would be. So basically, at the end of the climax, you will know whether or not the main conflict will be solved. And this might be, the climax might be something that doesn't end happily for the main character. Sometimes the climax ends and it's like a negative outcome, but you always know whether or not the main conflict has been solved. So go ahead right now, answer these questions. Why is the climax important to any story? What problems would a story have without one? And what is necessary for a good climax? What makes a good climax? So now that you've had time to think about this, it is the most exciting part of the book. It has lots of action. It includes details about characters' actions, thoughts, feelings, and words, as well as details about the setting, and it doesn't end too quickly. So basically you really need to know whether or not the problem will be solved at the end of this climax. So if it's not clear, you probably haven't come to the climax yet. Following the climax is the falling action, and these are the events that take place after the climax, and this is where things kind of slow down. So usually the rising action builds up to the climax and things get more intense, and the climax happens. It's the turning point of the story. You know whether or not the problem is going to be solved, and falling action, things are slowing down. No additional big action scenes or anything like that, and things are kind of tying up. So go ahead and answer some questions. Why is the falling action important to a story? What problems would a story have without the falling action? And what is necessary for a good falling action? So now that you've had some time to think and write your answers, falling action ties up all the loose ends of a story and gives the readers a feeling of satisfaction. So you're kind of understanding why things took place, your questions are being answered, and it slows down the action of the story so that it can come to its reasonable conclusion, which is what we'll finish this discussion with. So a conclusion is the end of the story. It's the final scene or information. It's also called the resolution. And the conclusion is not necessarily, here, let me go back. The conclusion does not necessarily have to be a happy conclusion or resolution. It could be really sad or upsetting. But the conclusion just ties up all the loose ends and kind of, like it says, concludes the story. And finally, the last bit of your work here is, why is the conclusion so important to the story, and what problems would you have without one? People sometimes ask about, like, what about cliffhangers, like where things are left where you know, like, maybe there will be a sequel or something like that. That's still a conclusion, though. Most of the things from the previous story and the conflict from that story have been answered and wrapped up, and maybe they're introducing new questions for the next story. However, your story should be wrapped up at the end. So what is necessary for a good conclusion will be your last question, and then we'll quickly talk about that and you will be on your way. Now that you have had time to write your questions down or write your answers down, remember loose ends have to be tied up. Major questions have to be answered. No new questions are posed unless it's like prompting you for a sequel. And it's unique and the ending is interesting. And it makes sense. So even if it's not happy, it makes sense. So last slide, I'm not going to have you write down the answers to all these questions, but these are just things to think about. What is plot overall, and what is the purpose of a plot? Why is it important? Have you ever had someone come up and tell you a story, and at the end of the story you're kind of like, cool story, bro. I don't really know what the point of that was. Well, they probably didn't have all the elements of plot in there. So why is plot so important? Because it makes for a good story. What does a plot map look like? This is something that you should be able to label. Just a hint, you will have an assessment that asks you to label a plot map. And let's see what the last discussion question is. What are some specific strategies that can be used to make each part of plot as good as it can be? And each part of the plot has its own strategies. Now this PowerPoint is going to be in your bookshelf on Otis, so you can always come back and reference this. But you guys did a great job, and thanks for listening to the PowerPoint on plot.